This is the first week of a new message series that we've called that wasn't what I was going to start with. This new series is about the four great feasts of this post-Easter season: the Feast of the Ascension, Pentecost, Trinity, and Corpus Christi. My reason for hesitating is because I had a setup which said finding a title for this series was difficult. So I mentioned in the previous series the title for the series, What Do You Do When God Isn't in the Place Where You Left Him, came after a conversation with some friends at a meal back in late January. The theme for this series arose out of a recent conversation I had with my online men's small group. We were talking about the new series and these four feast days, and one of them suggested end to the beginning, which, when you stop and think of it, is a little bit clever. The end of Jesus' ministry on earth, leading into the beginning of the ministry of the disciples and the growing of the church. I thought about it for a while, and then I decided that I would go a little bit more Australian. And with apologies to Paul Kelly of the superannuation industry, I called it From Little Things, Big Things Grow. The reason is that this whole story is about how the missionary disciples went out as they were given this commission by Jesus to preach to all the world. That's what he said to them on the mountaintop before he was ascended into heaven. He showed himself to the 11 and then go out to the whole world. Now, whether it's just the 11, as Mark alludes, or whether it's a larger number, doesn't really mean a great deal, because we know that it wasn't a huge number of people who began this ministry. Jesus left behind a small group of believers, and to them he entrusted this ministry of proclaiming the good news. Now, if we go back to the first reading from the book of Acts, that gives us a much bigger part of the story. That's not unusual. Mark's gospel tends to be fairly concise with what it says, but Luke tells us a lot more. He starts off by telling us that he's writing to a man by the name of Theophilus. Now, Theophilus is a name which means a friend of God. So he tells him what he wrote in the gospel. He tells him that everything Jesus had done and taught from the beginning until the day he gave the instructions to the apostles, and he had chosen through the Holy Spirit and was taken up into heaven. Luke then reminds this friend of God how Jesus had appeared to the disciples over a number of occasions before his ascension. But their story, as I mentioned during the last series, is that they didn't understand where God was in this story, because their immediate question is he now going to restore the kingdom of Israel? But Jesus tells them that it will be according to the will of God, not their kind of planning. But then he tells them that he's going to send this Holy Spirit to them. He says, you'll receive power when the Holy Spirit comes from you, and then you will be my witnesses, not only in Jerusalem, but throughout Judea and Samaria, and indeed to the ends of the earth. Now, back in 2008, there was this great event in Australia called World Youth Day, and numerous young people from all over Australia, but over 300 from Tasmania, went to Sydney for that event. The theme of World Youth Day that year was, you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes to you. Now that's from Acts chapter 1, verse 8. So if you write Acts 1, v. 8, what does it sound like? Activate. And that, for quite some time, became the theme of youth ministry in Tasmania. Activate. And so that's a positive thing. But let's go back to the book of Acts for a minute. Luke tells us that when Jesus was taken up to heaven, the disciples were still uncertain what to do. And they were standing there looking up into heaven, and we're told that the two men appeared and asked them, "Why are you standing here looking into the sky?" Jesus, who has been taken up from you into heaven, this same Jesus will come back in the same way as you have seen him go there. So the disciples still haven't worked out what the story is. They're wondering, is this going to be the restoration of the kingdom? Is he going to come back straight away? What's happening? We do know that they went back to the upper room, and while in the upper room they were praying, joined by some of the women and other disciples. And eventually we're told that the Holy Spirit came on them, and we hear that in our reading next Sunday. But today, the story is about this commission that they've been given to go out and proclaim the good news to all creation. Now, one of the great truths that arose out of the Second Vatican Council was the fact that every baptised Christian is called to live out this vocation, as we say in the word of today, to be a missionary disciple. Now, this truth was confrontational to many in our community, many of whom had grown up understanding that the role of the laity was to pray, pay and obey. To have any kind of input into the life of the church was something quite unexpected and not to their normal way of living. Luckily, we had bishops in Australia, people like Archbishop Guildford Young, who were telling people that they had a role to play in the life of the church, and it was more than just going to Mass. So we had groups such as YCW and the Christian Family Movement that rose up challenging young workers and married couples to be active in their workplace and in their marriages in new and wonderful ways. Ways that would lead people to want to become involved. But sadly, the best intentions in the world do not always mean that there will be great and all-lasting change. For a whole range of other events took place in the world about that same time. And they had an impact on the life of the church, not just on the laity, but the clergy and religious as well. I hate to say this, but we're moving rapidly towards the end of the first quarter of the 21st century. And we've also experienced a whole lot of changes in this century. We've experienced the sexual abuse scandal. We've had COVID, war. We've had conflict in so many parts of the world. That's why last weekend we announced that we would be praying for peace during these days between Thursday and next Saturday, Pentecost Eve. I checked on a website that tells us that there are something like 110 armed conflicts taking place in the world at this time. This isn't just Gaza and Ukraine, but many of them are called non-international armed conflicts. So it's not between nations, but it's internally. But for the people who are impacted by these events, they're just as real and just as deadly. Pope Francis is regularly inviting us to pray for peace and calling us to pray constantly for peace. He sends envoys to these places seeking some kind of mediation or cessation of this violence. The early church found its voice after the coming of the Holy Spirit. So we need to find ways so that our voices may be heard. Praying for the Holy Spirit to come into our lives to make us envoys of peace is not just an optional extra, but it should be a part of the reality of our everyday. So whilst we'll focus on the Holy Spirit and the way the Holy Spirit transforms the lives of the disciples next weekend, we know that the work that Jesus commissioned his disciples to do could only be accomplished through the coming of that Spirit. Now, if we continue to read the next part of the passage from Mark's Gospel, there's a little bit of a problematic part of it. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. Brendan Byrne, the Australian Jesuit, in his commentary writes, "The signs that are mentioned, including snake handling and drinking deadly poison, without harm, mind you, are best explained as being expressions of the triumph of the risen Lord. So rather than seeing them as something you might try to do to test your faith, please don't. They're signs of the Lord. Now there will be signs for all of us of the outward presence of God and of his power in our lives. But as Brendan Byrne suggests, these signs are a straight statement that the power of Satan has been overcome. It's been overcome by the resurrection, and now as the disciples prepare for the coming of the Holy Spirit, we too are aware of God's presence in our life so that we can overcome evil in our world. But the biggest change for any one of us will take place in our own hearts as we open our hearts to God. We need to come to him in prayer and with trust that the Holy Spirit may touch our lives and make us a new creation. Jesus promised that if we had faith the size of a mustard seed, we could move a mountain. So we're called to believe that from little things, big things will grow. And now is the time for us to prepare for the coming of God's Holy Spirit so that it will make a difference in our world and in our life.